Hello everyone! Welcome back to another video with me, Stephanie Canada, the owner of Backroom Finds. Today we're going to be discussing the history of feed sacks and their use through the ages. I'm going to give you guys a general history of the feed sack today, but if you want to know more and go more in depth with it, I'm going to link below a fabulous book and a couple other YouTube videos that really dive deeper into the history. Feed sacks have a few names, which you all know is my favorite thing to go find other names that people like to call things. So the common term is feed sack. There are also pretties, cotton commodity bags, and my personal favorite, chicken linen, because of the chicken feed that would come inside of them. What is a feed sack? My intention was to go to Merriam-Webster's dictionary and look up the term feed sack. This is what I got. The word you've entered isn't in the dictionary. A feed sack is a cotton bag that is used to store feed and flour, sugar, etc. Feed sacks started to be manufactured around 1845 with the invention of the locked stitch sewing machine. While it's contested as to who actually created the sewing machine, the general consensus is that Elias Howe created this machine. There are many makers of the feed sack. The first was attributed to H&L Chase Bag Company. This was a switch over from a large, heavy wooden barrel like we see wine and bourbon made in nowadays. The reason for the switch was because cotton was so much cheaper and lighter to carry and just easier to facilitate. The reason why this was cheaper is because of slavery. And the reason it stayed cheap was because of sharecroppers. Hashtag another form of slavery. So I'm acknowledging my bias here, but I wanted to really focus that these were cheap because of the way which they were made. Back when cotton bags were at the height of being produced, they took up 17% of the cotton that was manufactured. And while I would love to see companies go back to a more sustainable way of packaging their items as opposed to paper, which is then promptly thrown away, or plastic that sits in landfills for eons, I can't really say that cotton is terribly that much better. I'm just going to go ahead and read this off of here. Cotton farming is responsible for 24% of insecticides and 11% of pesticides, despite only using 3% of arable land in the US. 20,000 liters of water is needed to produce 1 kilogram of cotton. That's equivalent to a single t-shirt and a pair of jeans. Around the 1920s, paper started to come in as a viable option for cotton bags, so manufacturers ramped up advertising to keep the interest in the cotton bags. A lot of folks tend to think that cotton bags really started to be used for clothing and household goods around the Depression. It was used long before the Depression. Basically, as soon as these cotton bags started to be produced, women realized that they would have other uses at home, because it was basically free fabric, and fabric was expensive. The first step was really just a canvas bag with a label as to what was inside of it. Now, these original labels were extraordinarily hard to get off. People would use lard, people would use Fels naphtha. Apparently there was a southern tradition that if you tried to do it under a full moon, it would come off easier. Hey! Reports got back to the companies that these labels were extraordinarily hard to take off. To keep their bags desirable, companies then started to make a vegetable mixture to put their labels on so that they were slightly easier to get off. Now, in the 1920s, we began to see companies really start to lean into the usability or reusability of their bags. They would start with embroidery stamps or days of the week towels so that the husbands would have to go back if they hadn't gotten a full week. Once the embroidery was done, then you would rinse off the label of the manufacturer and the blue lining of the embroidery, leaving yourself a perfectly usable pillowcase or dish towel. Around the time that they were starting with the day of the week towels, you were also starting to see little towels come up that had puppets or stuffed animals printed on the far side of them, so that the women could then cut out and stuff the toys for their children. Around the mid-1930s, a brand called Staley's actually created the tint bag. And what this was an entirely colored bag, which was actually the first time anyone had done that. Who created the original printed bag? That question is still up for debate, but it's credited to the Percy Kent Bag Company. And we think it was one of their vice presidents, Richard Peake, who first got the idea to print a design onto the cotton fabric. Now this doesn't count for Gingham Girl, which had also done a red and white bag previously, but those had only gone over so well because there's only so much you can make look like a picnic blanket. So the Great Depression comes along, and these feed sacks turn into clothing for the family. Some reports show that as much as every piece of fabric that was in a house was made from feed sacks. That goes for your towels, your diapers, your underwear, all of these things. We went from occasional pieces being used to really have it being prevalent in the home. Now we're going to fast forward just a little bit through those delicious 1930s into World War II, and suddenly everything is rationed. That includes cotton. Now the interesting thing is that the manufacturers of feed and flour pushed to have cotton feed sacks labeled as industrial textiles, which means that they weren't part of the rationing effort. So now you could still go and get all of these beautiful prints and get your feed at the same time, which was sort of a stroke of genius of this industry. There was also rationing of how much fabric should be used, which means that the patterns that were coming out were really great, not only to repurpose using other clothing such as men's shirts, men's suits. I'll go ahead and link my video down below of where I showed you how to lay out a pattern on one of those bad boys. But also, the thinner lines allowed for less material. You didn't have a collar, you normally didn't have cuffs, it was all very slim. The skirts were getting shorter so as to conserve material so that more efforts could be put toward the war. I'm just gonna read this, it's easier. By 1943, in an effort to try to counter waste, the U.S. War Production Board regulated feed bag sizes to 6 styles that went from 2 to 100 pounds. The Textile Bag Manufacturers Association even at one point decreed, "A yard saved is a yard gained for victory." They would even go so far as to call the bags frugal and patriotic. The production of bags really went through the early 1960s, but after the war was over, the push to use feed sack bags now was back on the manufacturers and the advertisers because the rationing was over. You could go buy things again. Kind of like all of us, the day we can go back to the store and buy toilet paper. So what the feed sack manufacturers needed to do was to ramp up their advertising so that the women would continue to have their husbands buy the bags. I say this because a lot of the US was still a very rural industry, and so the wives would stay at home and the men would go to pick up the bags. Don't come at me, it's just the way it was. They would go so far as to partner with folks like Walt Disney to print their images onto the cotton bag so they would be even more desirable. Even into the early 50s, the manufacturers were starting to really feel the pull away from their product. So they started issuing booklets like the 1953 Pattern Service Book that specifically told you how to use the feed sacks and how many you would need for each garment. The interesting thing is that feed sacks were used as a part of everyday life. You would make a dress from it, which would take about 5 to 6 sacks. You could make kids' clothes, which would take about 2 to 3. And you sometimes would get one bag that you loved so much, you would send your husband with a swatch of the fabric so that he could go back to the feed store and get 3 to 4 more. Fun fact, these bags weighed at least 100 pounds. And so the workers there, occasionally when men would come in with a fabric swatch, they would all rustle together and start lugging them through. Because unlike fabric stores where everything's nicely and neatly arranged, yeah, it's a feed store. They're all just sort of stacked on top of one another. So a lot of the times the workers had to dig to get the exact feed sack print that the wife would want. Now I want to talk about the fashion that came out of this. I tend to think of feed sack dresses as being sort of drab, paisley, or calico, really small print, and very simple lines. And these do exist. But what's interesting about fashion as a whole in this time frame is that people would get really creative with these things. You could use them to make your kid a dress, and they would completely smock the entire front panel. So while your child's dress was actually made out of a feed sack, you couldn't really tell because you'd taken so much work along the top to really make it more detailed. The other one that I think is the most spectacular thing I've ever seen in my life. There is a set of 1930s beach pajamas. It's stunning. And you can tell it's made from scraps, but it doesn't matter because it's possibly the most beautiful thing. The detail with the embroidery along all of the stitch lines, how it comes to a point in the center with that gigantic button. Even the back is just as detailed as the front. And that's for beach pajamas! Some of the other uses for feed sacks in fashion were fashions at home. You primarily saw them for use in aprons. I'm going to show you here a picture of a half apron that I have that's made from a feed sack. I know this by the texture, but it's confirmed by the fact that I also saw this feed sack in the book I mentioned about earlier. I hope you guys enjoyed this little historical journey with me today. If you did, go ahead and click that like button. And if you want to see more videos from me, go ahead and click that subscribe button. Turn on that little bell for post notifications as well. See y'all next time!
3, 2, 1, go. Yes, I'm recording this.
Yeah, I know you did. Thanks. A feed sack, defined, is something I did not know. Fleek is in the dictionary, but feed sack isn't. Oh, no it's not. Okay, good. I feel a little better. Fleek is not actually in the Webster's dictionary. Good. Why are you laughing at me?
Your reaction.
You're not helping.
You're welcome.
All the editing. Editing magic. I want to know the name of the book. But if you'd like to know more, going. This is great. This is going really well.
No, it's not.
Shut up.